And so that led me to think, well, wait, could there be something? And if not actual aliens, what is this problem? Why are they so mysterious? And so that led me down the path of looking into the Sumerians specifically and their mythologies and accounts of their interactions with who some believe are extraterrestrials.
Chat.
Yeah.
Historian and renegade archaeologist, which I got from your website. So, for anybody who hasn't seen you on Ancient Aliens and other great programs and shows, who is Dr. Heather Lynn, and how did you end up as a renegade archaeologist?
Well, I am a one-time professor. I just recently resigned so that I could go and be a renegade full-time.
Yeah.
So aside from that, just a very regular, everyday person. I left home at the age of 16 to kind of explore, and it was a little wild. It was a time of sowing wild oats, and so over that time, I got really interested in, at the time, what was on AM radio. It was late night radio. There used to be shows like Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and I don't know. Maybe people are familiar with that, maybe not, but they would feature guests that would talk about very strange topics.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating. It captured my attention. And I thought maybe one day I'll be able to speak to strange and eccentric, interesting people about strange topics. And I just left it at that. But I went back to school and studied art history and a host of other topics. And I found my way into archaeology. And through that journey, I started discovering that there was a bit of a dogma in the discipline where people weren't necessarily as open-minded as they could be. There was a
Yeah.
lot of focus on trying to preserve egos and status, and it really wasn't doing it for me, but I stayed in and continued to pursue alternative theories, sort of part-time. And then eventually, once I got my doctorate, I left and said, well, okay, I'm a professor and I have to pay the bills, but I started doing investigations on my own into some of these strange topics and
Yeah.
found my way writing books, doing shows and that sort of thing until now I'm doing it full time. But essentially, I'm just somebody who's very passionate about these things. I think that nobody has the final answer in a discipline like archaeology, where it is scientific. There's a scientific methodology, but it still relies on the interpretation of fallible human beings. So I think there's still wiggle room and mystery in it. And that's what I aim to solve, or at least investigate.
Yeah. So, well, the first thing that everybody might going to ask: aliens. What have aliens got to do with history? And does that Well, I suppose maybe let's, because you obviously had this period when you were studying history, and then at some point you must have heard about one of these theories and thought, well, I'll just look into that. And then what was the first thing that you sort of realized, oh, maybe there's something to this kind of alternative set of theories? And talk a little bit about that kind of, or talk about aliens. Let's talk about aliens.
Just get right to the aliens. So about the aliens. Yeah, that's an interesting one because looking into the past, there's a very conventional set of mysteries you'd look into, how the pyramids were built and that sort of thing. I found my way into investigating and researching the Sumerians. And this
Yeah.
was an area that a lot of people had discussed in the 1970s. You have individuals who wrote books like Eric von Daniken, Chariots of the Gods, which was one of the first to popularize the idea of ancient aliens and ancient visitations. And that was good fun. So I started reading a little of that, seeing if there was any bit of truth to that, or was it all just fun? Then I came across an author, Zechariah Sitchin, who wrote in the 1970s as well a book called The 12th Planet. And he had a whole theory about the Sumerian people, people who lived in Mesopotamia, which is now modern day Iraq. And he proposed that their tablets said that aliens came and helped teach them how to build their pyramids, which are called ziggurats, and interbred with humans and altered our DNA. And it was pretty wild. And I thought, well, this is fun. What I noticed was a lot of people believed it.
Yeah.
And why are people, I mean, because it seemed a little far-fetched. So I started looking more into the Sumerians. Then I came across a body of work from legitimate academics that discussed how fascinating the Sumerians really were and why we have this time vacuum and mystery behind how they suddenly appeared. It's what's called the Sumerian problem.
Yeah.
And so that led me to think, well, wait, could there be something? And if not actual aliens, what is this problem? Why are they so mysterious? And so that led me down the path of looking into the Sumerians specifically and their mythologies and accounts of their interactions with who some believe are extraterrestrials.
So, from your kind of like scientific background, why did you? What was it about the Sumerian texts and things that first made you think, oh, actually, maybe this is extraterrestrial, as opposed to trying to fix some other kind of narrative to it? Like, why did you like? Did you sort of think, well, maybe I should look into this theory first, or was it a case that that was just the most obvious explanation?
Well, there were a lot of mysteries associated with the Sumerians, so there was a lot of room to start investigating. And I thought, clearly this can't be right. This can't be some alien narrative. So I dug into the text myself and discovered that, well, interestingly, there are more cuneiform, which is the writing that they used in the clay tablets. It's called cuneiform writing. There are more cuneiform tablets available from the Sumerians than there are even the Egyptians, because the
Yeah,
Egyptians wrote on papyrus, and that's highly biodegradable. And so the Sumerians wrote on these cuneiform tablets that have lasted and persisted 6,000 years. They're literally the first historians. History begins in ancient Sumer. So,
yeah.
in looking at all of these texts and seeing that many of them haven't even been translated, it leaves open this huge field to investigate. And so I thought, well, what do the people say? What These are the great historians. They recorded everything down to complaints about different things they purchased. They had bills and complaints, and they had letters from children to their parents about how they should have bought them better clothes or made them better clothing. And everyday things like recipes, medical textbooks. I mean, this was a highly advanced civilization. And they wrote everything down. They kept every bill, every bit of bureaucracy. And so I thought, well, clearly they've said something. And so
Yeah.
looking into their text, I thought, rather than look at these secondary sources, let's see what the primary source says and investigate, how do people get this idea that aliens were the ones who contacted them? And then I discovered that Sumerian problem again is what we have in that time in the world in history. Prehistorically, are a group of semi-settled hunter-gatherers. These are people who, they don't have writing, they don't have anything historical yet. They do have some culture, they have pottery, they have things of that nature, but they don't have a civilization in the way that we understand civilization. So science and math and buildings. Then all of a sudden, in this region, this one little spot, over the course of just 200 years, civilization appears. And the Sumerians are fantastic in what they invented the wheel, astronomy, they invented medicine, and it was actually quite an interesting and effective form of medicine. They even had medical malpractice insurance, and that's where we get the idea of an eye for an eye. If you were an
Yeah.
optometrist and you took out a cataracts and did it wrong, well, you had to give up one of your eyes. So it was a whole system put into place just within 200 years. Additionally, their language wasn't related to any other language in the region. So to this day, even in a mainstream sense, people have no idea how any of this happened. So when you look at the mythology and the accounts of the Sumerians themselves, they explicitly say that individuals who they referred to as gods came from above. They had princely blood, and they came to the region, discovered that there were people there, and went so far as to enslave them and force them to be laborers in building agriculture. And they have a whole cosmology and all these explanations. The question becomes, well, who were these individuals? The Sumerians called them their gods. They say multiple times they were not like them. They were larger. They were sometimes referred to as the shining ones. They came from above, they came from the heavens. So you could then interpret that to be that perhaps they were actual gods in some sort of deified sense. You could say, well, maybe they were aliens. So over time, I followed that path to see, well, what could the answer be? What I found was sometimes disappointing to some people, but I thought it opened up a new set of mysteries, which is, in a way, it seems to be that they were like what's called a cargo cult. That's where in some uncontacted tribe encounters something that falls from a plane. They don't understand at all the concept of what happened, but they venerate this idea of the plane giving them a gift, and it becomes part of their cosmology and their theology. So this is something very human. If there was an individual or there was a group of individuals who came from a long distance away in like a migration pattern, and they came upon a group of semi-settled hunter-gatherers, they could very well present themselves as gods. And the people there could see that they had all of this great technology and start to believe, hey, these are our gods. And you start to see that echoing over and over. And what we get in the Sumerian text are the first accounts of the global flood story,
Yeah.
the accounts that informed the Old Testament and other texts as well. So when you look too at the timeline of some of this, it goes back to this time called the Younger Dryas, where it's postulated that there was an impact that caused a great catastrophe and global climate change, and then the melting of some ice displacing people, having, in areas, not necessarily like how cartoons would have it where the entire world was flooding, but in particular regions there could
Yeah.
have been, catastrophic flooding that could displace groups of people. And so in my view, it seems possible that there was an ancient lost civilization, sometimes associated with Plato's Atlantis, often in the mythos of ancient mythology, that there was a group of highly advanced individuals who came through and spread this technology. What's interesting, though, is I can never quite rule out this extraterrestrial influence, because the more I looked into who are called the Anunnaki, they ended up being called the Anunnaki. These are the gods of the Sumerians, the potential displaced people. They brought with them their own religion and their own gods. And those gods they refer to as being semi biological beings that they could communicate with, that came from the sky, came from the ocean, and they could, in some ways, telepathically communicate. And they were associated specifically with the Pleiadian star system. So it gets a little weird the deeper you go into the most ancient religion, perhaps. And it does have this otherworldly component. So it's deeply fascinating, and I continue to research it.
Okay, so what sort of time period? I, these are like some of the. This is like one of the first civilizations on Earth, isn't it? Like
Yes,
anybody before them, or are they like the first? And so, what sort of time frame was that?
they're the
Was
first. So there's many different types of individuals, and there's groups of people, and
yeah,
we can go all the way back to the most interesting, probably now, find of 12,500 years ago, Göbekli Tepe. But that's still not considered a civilization per se,
yeah,
because they don't have writing. They don't yet. I mean, they have said perhaps that over time we may discover in Göbekli Tepe, which is in Turkey, that maybe we'll find something that will indicate that they had a higher civilization. There's still
yeah.
a lot of digging to go. But as of now, they were the first. The Sumerians were the first. So there had been people, like I said, there's cultures and activity, even some semi like settlements and things, but not quite a civilization. So this would have been about 6,000 years ago that these individuals ended up making whole walled cities, building pyramids, having a complete set of gods, having all of these different stories, and then creating things that we use to this day, like the concept of the end of a workday, the concept of professions that can be taught, literacy, writing, even things like medicine, specifically pills. They would
Yeah.
prescribe pills, things that we would think of as being very modern, they invented right there in this one small area at this one point in time. So the question is, How?
Yeah. So, like, I'm going to play. Well, I wouldn't say devil's advocate because I don't know what non-alien advocate. And if there were aliens helping them or ruling them, what happened to them? Where did they go? Did they leave, or were they overthrown by the Sumerians? Do you have any ideas about like what happened to these aliens? Were they like? Have you? Well, I mean, obviously it's going to be theories. I'm not sure there's any like tablet that says we overthrew the aliens. But what do you think? If there were aliens involved, what happened to them? Why aren't they still here?
Well, a few things. The Sumerians themselves discuss how this was a small group of individuals that came,
Yeah,
and they were not allowed to breed with the existing humans. And so they kept them separate. But
yeah,
throughout a generation, they ended up breeding. And this is where we get in a biblical story the idea of the Nephilim. The gods looked upon the daughters of man and found them fair, and then they did what they weren't supposed to, and then created
mm,
these Nephilim out of it. So they're connected to that story. Well, if you do that over time, the first group is not there anymore. They basically assimilate. So one
yeah,
could say if these were extraterrestrials, then perhaps that lineage is in a lot of people ancestrally. If you consider that perhaps these humans that came in and they were displaced from a cataclysm, and they brought their particular form of religion where it does appear that they were worshiping some kind of off-world entity that they referred to as Apkallu, or the sages. That would suggest that those sages, those Apkallu, are still interacting with people today, because we have a tablet called the Sumerian Kings List. And on that Kings List, it has documentation of the first Anunnaki kings. And next to that name is their assigned sage, almost like a guardian angel or some kind of,
yeah,
spirit guide or something to that effect. And then over time, you see the Anunnaki names give way to more human royal bloodline, but still those sages exist. And it's implied that these sages, these off-world entities, are quietly advising the elites of the world, perhaps even today.
Oh, okay. So, World Economic Forum has this big view of aliens telling them what to do or whatever you want to
I
say.
mean, they talk about some of the ways that they have reached them would be through specifically what's called orgiastic behavior. So yes, maybe orgies, but also drum circles, music, anything that gets you in a frenzy in a communal way, but also meditation, trance, and psychedelics.
Yeah,
So there is evidence of people who are doing this microdosing and psychedelics, especially in Silicon Valley, and they believe it is getting them in touch with entities, specifically through DMT, that they refer to as the machine elves or sometimes the clockwork elves. And they're described very similar to extraterrestrials.
yeah. Okay.
That's
So,
scary, isn't it, to think? Because I always say this, it sounds crazy.
yeah,
However, it doesn't really matter if it's true or not, or if you believe it's true. There are individuals who have positions of power who they do believe this, and they are acting in a capacity where they believe this, and then they make decisions.
yeah.
So at that point, I don't know how much it matters, but there are people who do believe it, and they can push buttons and make
Right.
decisions, and that's
Before
spooky.
we before we end up going totally off track here, um, the archaeology side of this. So, do you actually go out to places and try and find like to Sumerian sites and things and try and find like new tablets and stuff, or how does the archaeology side work for you? Because obviously, I'm guessing Iraq isn't necessarily the easiest place to get to. Or, like, how does the archaeology side work for this, and how are you trying to determine exactly how all these relationships work?
Well, there's a great deal of information available online and in
Yeah,
museums because of the earlier excavations that have been done, and a lot of the tablets have been cataloged and not yet translated. And there's
yeah,
efforts underway now to translate them, even using artificial intelligence. But um, believe it or not, Iraq is a country that is building, and they're coming back better than ever. and they're
Yeah.
very hospitable. I'm going there to do some research in October. So it's still not maybe the safest place. It still has
Yeah.
its ups and downs, but compared to decades in the past, they're ready. They're ready to open the doors to the world. They're building better hotels and infrastructure to try to get everybody to come in and say, hey, we're open to the world. And they
Yeah.
themselves really want to know their past because it's such an area of national pride to think, hey, we are the cradle of civilization. So they,
Mm.
so they do let different research groups come in. I think right now the University of Manchester is doing a project there. So it's just been touch and go over time, but it is opening up. And even I know a few people who are there looking at sites and doing some documentary filmmaking. So I think that in the future, there's the relatively short future, we're going to see a lot more discoveries and a lot more opportunities for excavation.
Yeah. So that's good in a way. I mean, it's funny how different areas of the world open up and close. So if you were somebody who wanted to visit Russia or Ukraine in the West, you'd kind of having the problem at the moment, and Syria's probably bad, but
Yeah.
Iraq is now opening up. So let's talk about what I started with, because like you said that you thought men made the Egyptian pyramids. So what are your views? Because there's obviously there's something about people and Egyptian pyramids and the fact that people think aliens made them. What are your views on Egypt in terms of the whole aliens and conspiracy theories and all the rest of it? There's probably less evidence there. Is that what you would say?
I would say there's less evidence if there were to be evidence. I
Yeah,
also think that this specifically the Egyptians, they have a lot of documentation on at least their walls that
yeah,
show how they did what. Now
yeah,
there's still mystery surrounding how they built the pyramids. It's still a work in progress trying to figure that out. But at no point are there images of alien beings or anything helping. But also, humans are amazing.
yeah,
We don't really need the help of little green men to build these types of monuments. But the question still, I think, is less one of a technical question, but more so one of a inspiration. What was it that inspired people to do these things? And could that have been something that is more of that extraterrestrial bent? Sometimes people say, hey, I was inspired. Well, the word
yeah,
inspire comes from inspirare in Latin, meaning that specifically a god were to blow an idea into you, like, and there's often been this notion that we get divine inspiration. And what would that be? Would that be angels? Some people would say they're demons, because if it's a bad thing, then you've been possessed by an idea. But when you look at all of those words that just come out of different cultures and different areas and times, they're all a little bit talking about a shared phenomena. And that's one that I think is we something we haven't quite discovered or understood. Carl Jung talked about it being archetypes and a collective unconscious. There's talks of aliens, of course, now in a more scientific age, but there's also angels and demons and jinn, and the Gnostics had archons, and everybody had their own name for this phenomena. So there's a shared phenomena, I think, going through time and different cultures globally that we just can't quite figure out. How is it that we get these ideas? And I think we just have different names for this. And right now, I think the current name would be aliens, although with more and more people becoming what they call psychonauts and dabbling in this world of psychedelics to try to get in touch with the so-called divine, you start to enter in these interdimensional beings, these clockwork elves or machine elves. And so we may go from having something very biological in the sense that it is an extraterrestrial gray with the large eyes. We may start seeing in popular culture more accounts and more visions of things that are more toward that psychedelic bent. But I think it's all just a placeholder for one thing that we experience as humans that we can't quite understand.
yeah. So it could be some sort of. They're not aliens. They're kind of maybe they're in a slightly different dimension or something, and then like it's not. I mean, I suppose that's the thing. We don't know what they are. Alien, as in not terrestrial, really, rather than anything else.
I would say they're aliens. We could have aliens right here with us, and maybe we just don't see because they're on that different plane. And it's more of a dimensional question than it is a physical question like it is in the science fiction novels and
Or,
movies.
or maybe they're all in the Houses of Parliament and Congress. And
The way the world's going right now, it's
yeah.
I don't know.
Let's talk about your books, because I know you've written quite a few books. What was the first book you wrote, and what did it discuss? And also, how many books have you written in total?
Oh, total. I don't actually know. Sadly, maybe 10
Oh,
here and
okay.
there, just different
Yeah,
ones. I have a few that are probably the more current ones that I'd be known for. One of them is called Evil Archaeology.
yeah.
And that one was a fun book about the origin and history of demons and haunted artifacts and that sort of thing. And it really does talk more about the Sumerians. And I was inspired for that because of the film The Exorcist. And the very beginning of the film and the book, the priest goes to Iraq and he sees this demon. And it's a demon called Pazuzu. And that's the demon that is inferred to have possessed the main character. Well, I came across a news story that talked about a guy who had legally changed his name to Pazuzu because he was worshiping the Sumerian god. And over time, he collected neighbors and started cannibalizing them and murdering them and putting them in his backyard. He was arrested and taken to prison. And he was begging his psychiatrist and the jail and his mother to please let him do his sacrifices to the Sumerian gods and demons. And they said, yeah, no, no, go back. No,
Yeah.
that's not going to happen. He said, but if you don't, Pazuzu's going to kill me. And they said, no, it's not going to happen. Well, that night they heard noise from his cell. They came in and they saw that he was dead and they couldn't understand how he died. He didn't have a cellmate and there were scratches all over his body and he bled out because his arteries had been sliced open.
Oh,
So it was like, that's strange. And so I started thinking about the role of evil and the concept of icons and images carrying with it this inspiration of evil and what that actually means in the world and how people have dealt with evil through cultural history. So it's not for the faint of heart. It does go into some kind of gruesome discoveries, but some of them are funny. One of them is the Mesopotamian toilet demon. And that was a demon in Sumer that,
yeah.
would basically get you if you're on the toilet and kind of like Elvis, if you would die on the toilet from a heart attack. So you got to watch out for the Mesopotamian toilet demon. But after that, I've written books on the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki Connection is my bestseller. And currently I have a book coming out October 7th, and that one is about the history of Baphomet, if anyone is familiar with that. Baphomet's that spooky figure that is often associated with Satanism. It's a half man, half goat sitting in a spooky position with bare breasts and a pentagram on his head, and he's quite scary. So I go into the surprising history of that icon. Because spoiler alert, I'll just give this because there's so many other twists and turns, but the spoiler alert is that the image was originally illustrated by a French Catholic priest who thought he was making a beautiful Catholic icon to meditate with that would show the love and acceptance and forgiveness of God. And it's a whole thing. And then it was co-opted by a lot of different political movements and social movements. And it's an interesting and scary image. So I thought, well, it's good to face fears. And when people are educated on something, they fear it less. And so rather than fear the spooky image, they could say, oh, I get what's happening here and not be afraid of it.
Okay, so I've got to ask you, for anybody's watching, what are your tips about avoiding evil demons and things? Like, obviously, we've got the toilet demon. I'm not sure there's anything anybody can do about that. But,
Well,
are there any things that you shouldn't do to avoid demons and evil stuff in the past? Or are you basically just screwed if some evil demon decides to pick on you?
well, I did for my evil archaeology book. I interviewed a host of people, exorcists and ghost hunters, and collected that information And the things that I came away with were surprisingly consistent with all these different types of people from different religious backgrounds and beliefs. So the things that I pull out of that, I thought, these are pretty good. So one thing is that demons, in theory, don't just pop into you, thankfully. You have to invite them in, kind of like that old adage about the vampire. We have to let it in. So as long as you're not willfully giving your spirit up to something demonic, you should be fine. So that's one. And two, as strange as it sounds, you want to make sure that everything around you is as positive as can be. You want to make sure you have a clean surrounding, which I thought was an interesting one, but everybody seemed to agree on that there's something about that old term, cleanliness is next to godliness, that
Yeah.
when you have a chaotic surrounding, it sort of attracts this negative energy. And so essentially, the idea is to keep your surroundings clean, uplifted, positive, put things around yourself that make you feel happy, and try to keep a positive mood. Don't do drugs, don't do
Mm.
alcohol, don't do any kind of substances and fall prey to that. But ultimately, know that demons don't pop into you and pop out of you at will, that you have free will and you can decide whether or not you're going to go down that way.
Okay. So hopefully we'll all be protected then by just living a clean, well, getting the vacuum out and
Get the
cleaning
vacuum
up.
out, clean your house. Yep.
Okay, so which one I like, because there's so many questions I could ask, but we could be here all night talking about alien stuff. What? Well, let's finish on the alien. The $1 million question is like, why aren't we visited by aliens more? Like,
Mm.
do you think we are being visited by aliens and it's been suppressed? Do you think we're in some sort of nature reserve in the universe that means that the aliens aren't allowed to come here or they have to be kind of protected? Or it's just the expanse of space, it's very hard for them to travel. Like, why aren't there aliens? Like, why aren't we seeing on the news another spaceship coming in and landing in Trafalgar Square?
It's a great question. I think that maybe because we are the aliens, we don't recognize that we have this strange sort of DNA, we'll say.
Yeah,
And I say that because there is a theory out there that I think when you look into it is pretty remarkable and not really far-fetched. It used to be considered far-fetched, but a lot more people have accepted this idea of panspermia. There's an alternate idea called directed panspermia, and that just suggests that there's an intelligence behind it. But panspermia in general is this notion that the seeds of life come and go throughout the universe and get hitch a ride and then interact, and boom, there's life. And so I think that in that sense, when you're looking for extraterrestrials, you may again be anthropomorphizing and thinking, where are these humans or type creatures
mm,
or little green men? But really, the extraterrestrials can be viruses that hitch a ride and blast into our atmosphere, especially ending up in the water and mixing and infecting. And there's plenty of evidence. I write about this in my Anunnaki Connection book about this idea of the oceans getting seeded with all these extraterrestrial viruses and changing the genetic makeup of creatures and altering them and this sort of thing. So there's a lot of questions on how it could actually be done. It could be something through just microbiology. It could be something like, well, they are here, but because they're interdimensional, we just don't have the ability to perceive them. We're
yeah,
limited to our senses. So they could be standing right here in front of us and we can't observe it at all. So it could be that. It could be perhaps that there are visitations and governments have it on lockdown and we just don't know. But I tend to question that
yeah,
a lot, especially these days when you see so many of them coming out with this great evidence and talking about there's whistleblowers and we're admitting to it now. And I think, I don't know. I don't know about that. So I don't know. I think that we probably won't recognize an alien if we saw it. And yeah, and I do believe there has to be life on other planets. So it could very well be that life is just not at an evolutionary state. They don't have thumbs, they can't build things, and they can't get out of their orbit to even come get to us.
Well, I mean, we haven't gone anywhere else really, apart from the moon.
Exactly.
So, okay, I've thought of another question. I'm extending this interview longer than I would normally do, but when you go to Iraq this year, what would be like the most interesting thing for you to discover somewhere in Iraq? Like, what would the Rosetta Stone be of the kind of ancient alien history kind of world? Like, what would be the thing that you would, if you discovered it, you'd be like, oh, that's amazing. Like,
Well, that's a fantastic question.
Everything.
I think given their literary history, it would have to be something written on tablets. So it would have to be something that they said specifically on a particular tablet. So what that would be, it's difficult because most of the tablets that are found are like grain receipts and real estate transactions, and sifting through that. But there are mythical or legendary artifacts that could be discovered. One of which is called the Tablet of Destinies. And if anything like that were to be found, or maybe even better yet, if there was a grave that was discovered, perhaps any indication that there could have been a burial of one of these Anunnakis.
Yeah.
So that would be probably the most fascinating. There have been people who talk about that they found graves like that. And you see a bunch of things online, but they're not real. It would be interesting to see if you could find the burial of one of these original kings or extraterrestrials or aliens or whatever they are, to get that evidence and see for ourselves.
Yeah, I guess you would have a problem in that you'd have to be very careful with security or something like that, because any excuse for somebody to say it was tampered with, and it's like this alien DNA thing was actually something you just shoved something in a grave.
Oh, they wouldn't like that. They had a person high up in their government not too long ago come out and say publicly on a news at a press release, they were there saying that their gods had contact with extraterrestrials, and they had built these runways so that they could blast off into space. And he said all this publicly, and they went bonkers. So he disappeared. I don't know where he went. He was eventually jailed for some sort of bureaucratic thing, taxes or whatnot. But he was kind of a national embarrassment for a moment. So yeah, I don't know how that would go.
Yeah. Okay. So let's finish up by, how can people? You've got your own podcast, your own show, and you're also on Alien. Well, I've forgotten the name of the show now, but you're also on like quite a few TV programs and other things. But how can people find out about you? How can they find out more about your books? And how can they find out about your podcast?
You can go to my website at www.drheatherlynn.com. It's drheatherlynn.com. And there's where you can find all my books and links to the show and everything else. And you can even email me.
Yes. And what's your podcast called? And how can people?
The Midnight Academy. That is everywhere podcasts are, and including YouTube.
Ooh. And what are you talking about? What are you talking about on your podcast? And who are you talking? Just general.
The Midnight Academy is sort of an attempt to have an after dark educational experience. So we bring on guests that have interesting ideas, but they're professionals in their fields. So a lot of alternative archaeology. To my recent episode, we're talking about the origin of the zodiac, Ice Age cave drawings and their meanings. I spoke to Michael Cremo, who's known as the Forbidden Archaeologist. I have somebody coming up that we're going to talk about the psychology of horror and nightmares and how that relates to archetypes. So kind of everything from aliens to ancient history to science and things that are a little offbeat.
That sounds really fun. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today, Heather.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure.
And thanks to all the people watching. And there have been people watching. They've been quiet in the comments, but there have been people watching. So, and thanks to all the people who are going to watch on YouTube in the future. So, thanks to everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
This is what God requires.